with that resounding start, I'd like to welcome everyone to our second parallel session for the day. I'd like to welcome all of our distinguished guests and distinguished panelists. My name is Robert Smith, and I'm going to be your moderator for this parallel session. I'd like to welcome you all here on behalf of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, where I'm a senior associate, and also on behalf of Canada's International Development Research Centre, who has made my participation here possible, and our partners in the T20 Task Force 5 and 9, who I'd like to thank very much for the excellent organization of the summit so far. So congratulations to Professor Bombong and others who have been involved in the organization of the summit. Today's session is titled Moving Beyond GDP and Towards Inclusive Wealth, Implications for SDG Financing and Other Long-Term Decision Making. And I don't know if any of you have had a chance to look at the T20 communique that was released this morning during the opening ceremonies. But if you do look at the communique, you will find that one of the recommendations in there is, in fact, that G20 countries should move beyond GDP and towards the measurement of inclusive wealth as part of a broader well-being framework. So I and others were certainly delighted to see that recommendation included in the T20 communique, and that sets obviously an excellent basis for inclusion of it in the G20 communique as well. So the topic for today is, in fact, this question of moving beyond GDP and how that will influence long-term decision-making. Let me just say a word or two more about my background. I was the Director of Environmental Statistics at Canada's National Statistics Agency for a long time. Since 2013, I've been a private consultant based in Ottawa, working more or less on questions related to the measurement of well-being and progress and how to improve those measures. Along with colleagues from IISD in Ottawa and the Global Solutions Initiative and others, I was lead author of the TF9 policy brief on moving beyond GDP and co-author of the related TF5 paper with Professor Snower and colleagues from the Global Solutions Initiative. Before outlining today's session further, I'd like to introduce our panelists, two of whom we have here with us in Bali, and three of whom you will see on your screen at some point in the near future. So I'd like to introduce them, and I'll do so in alphabetical order, starting with my colleague and good friend, Dr. Matthew Agarwala, who is joining us virtually from Cambridge in England today. Dr. Agarwala leads the Wealth Economy project at the University of Cambridge there. His focus is broadly on wealth accounting, natural and social capital measurement, green finance, the economics of well-being, amongst many other topics. His work is indeed very wide-ranging. He collaborates with ecologists, conservationists, anthropologists, parliamentarians, and he counts several Nobel laureates amongst his colleagues, something that most of us can't claim. He works closely with the UN, the World Bank, central banks, and others to highlight nature-related financial risks. He's a sought-after public speaker and a regular contributor to the BBC and other prominent media outlets. And I'd like to welcome Matthew and thank him for joining us. Next, in alphabetical order, we have Dr. David Katchen. No, we don't. We have Professor Bombong Brojanegoro, of course, who doesn't really require any introduction, but I'll introduce him nonetheless. Professor Bombong is the lead co-chair of the T20, so we have him and his colleagues to thank for us being here today. He's also the lead co-chair of Task Force 9 that I was involved in. But he does many other things as well. He's involved in the senior leadership roles with two of Indonesia's leading telecom companies. He's chairman of the Economic Empowerment Agency of the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce. For more than 10 years, he was deeply involved in the government of Indonesia, serving as Indonesia's Minister of Finance, Minister of Development and Planning, and if that wasn't enough, also Minister of Research and Technology. Professor Bombong earned his PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and he is currently a professor of economics at the University of Indonesia. So welcome, Professor Bombong, and thank you very much for joining us. Next, we have Dr. David Kachin, who's joining us virtually today from Jakarta. David is a senior economist with the World Bank. He's currently based in Jakarta. He works on investment operations and research for the bank's environment, natural resources, and blue economy global practice. He's an environmental and resource economist by training, focuses on topics such as fisheries, forest, water management, and air pollution. He's worked on the preparation and design of investments in reforestation and mangrove restoration in Bangladesh, water pollution control in the Yangtze River, and marine conservation here in Indonesia. David completed his PhD in environmental and resource economics at Duke University in North Carolina in the US, and he's a fellow at the School of Business at the University of South Australia. So I'd like to thank David also for joining us. Next, we have Dr. Radhika Lal, who is joining us also virtually. Dr. Lal is coming from Bangkok in Thailand. Radhika is the senior SDG finance policy advisor and team lead at UNDP's Bangkok regional hub. Prior to this, she served as economic policy advisor and headed the economic and strategic policy unit for UNDP in Ghana. She's also worked with UNDP in South Africa, Brazil, and New York. She's a political economist by training. She has an MA in economics from Jawaharlal Nehru University in India, and her current focus is on SDG financing strategies and investment opportunities and related green and sustainable finance initiatives. She's also interested in engaging in integrated policy design to address the intersection of economic, social, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development and resilience. So thank you to Dr. Lal for joining us as well. Last but not least, we have Professor Dennis Snower, who is also joining us here in Bali on stage with me. Professor Snower also needs no introduction to the T20 community, having been deeply involved in supporting the T20 in various ways for a long time. He's had a long and distinguished career, too long to go over. We'd need the whole session to talk about it. Currently, he's the president of the Global Solutions Initiative in Berlin. In his spare time, he's also program chair at the New Institute, a fellow at the Oxford New Institute for Economic Thinking and the Brookings Institute. He earned his BA and MA from New College, Oxford, and his MA and PhD from Princeton. He's an expert in labor economics, socioeconomics, public policy, and inflation unemployment trade-offs, and is currently working on a new economic paradigm with the evolutionary biologist David Sloan Wilson. So thank you, Dr. Snower, very much for joining us. So with those introductions, I'd like to now say a few words that will orient today's discussion. World leaders increasingly believe it's time to move beyond GDP, gross domestic product, as the central measure of national progress. Back in 2018, when the G7 leaders met in Canada, heads of state there agreed that GDP was insufficient for measuring success. In the same vein, the UN Secretary General has more recently called our reliance on GDP a glaring blind spot in how we measure economic prosperity and progress. This blind spot, according to the Secretary General and others, is one of the factors limiting the financing required to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals and realize the 2030 Agenda, amongst other long-term objectives. So our over-reliance on GDP is increasingly seen to be a hindrance to development and not a help. Secretary General Guterres has committed himself to bringing a proposal for moving beyond GDP to member states in the next few months, which is welcome news indeed. And along with the recognition in the T20 communique of the need to move beyond GDP, this is a clear signal that the world is now committed to doing this, to moving beyond GDP, and that's really wonderful. Our view is that there's only a handful of measures that are serious contenders for moving beyond GDP. We have to recognize that GDP has many strengths, and those strengths account for its popularity amongst decision makers. It's concise, it's theoretically clear, and it's statistically sound after many, many decades of measuring it. Any complementary measures that we propose to move beyond GDP have to be equally robust, or they won't be accepted by decision makers. So the view of me and my colleagues at IISD and others around the world is that the concept of inclusive, or as it's sometimes called, comprehensive wealth, is the best contender for moving beyond GDP. We're going to hear from our panelists in more detail exactly what inclusive wealth is, but let me just say briefly that inclusive wealth measures the assets that underlie human well-being: human capital, natural capital, social capital, produced and financial capital. This is what we call the inclusive wealth portfolio. And there's extremely well worked out theory that has been worked out by colleagues at the World Bank, the United Nations, Cambridge University, and elsewhere that shows that an increase in inclusive wealth signals an increase in well-being. Conversely, when inclusive wealth falls, well-being must fall eventually as well. Inclusive wealth is, therefore, a powerful measure of long-term sustainability, and one that we think is a serious contender to move beyond GDP. But let me be clear that our view is not that GDP needs to be abandoned in moving towards inclusive wealth. Rather, GDP will remain important to decision makers, even in a world beyond it. But GDP must be dislodged from its spot at the center of decision makers' dashboards. Room must be made for new measures that are better suited to today's challenges. In particular, going beyond GDP means coming up with measures that will promote broad and long-term well-being across economic, social, and environmental dimensions. Amongst other things, such measures are key to ensuring adequate funding for the achievement of the SDGs. When GDP is front and center, decision-making is focused on short-term gains at the expense of long-term sustainability. The challenge for our panelists today is to imagine a world where inclusive wealth measures are already front and center on decision makers' dashboards. That's not the world that we live in today, but I want our panelists to imagine that we live in that world. In that world, what would these new measures look like? How would they be used? What kinds of policies would governments bring forth that are different from policies today? These are complex and obviously hypothetical questions, but hearing from our group of experts promises to be extremely interesting and illuminating and important because, as I've said, the world has committed to moving beyond GDP. Exactly what it will move to is not yet clear. We hope, though, that inclusive wealth will be part of a broader well-being framework. So I'd like to get us started by offering each of our panelists, again in alphabetical order, the opportunity to provide some initial thoughts on why moving beyond GDP is so important and why inclusive wealth measures should be part of this broader well-being framework. So I'll start by giving the floor to Dr. Agarwala. He has the luxury or the pleasure of being first in the alphabetical list. So please, Matthew, the floor is yours to hear your thoughts on this important topic. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction and erudite and informative opening, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here. I only wish that I could be there with you in person. I think I'd like to start with a bit of an ode to GDP. Whether we are talking about income growth, poverty reduction, increases in literacy rates, the empowerment of women and girls around the world, and increases in life expectancy in all parts of the world. The 20th century model of economic growth has brought about tremendous improvements in the human condition. The problem for us today, though, is that that 20th century economic model is bearing very different gifts today in the 21st century. A constellation of crises, a climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis, an air quality crisis, a crisis of access to water and sanitation services. Combined, these threaten to wipe out those gains that we have seen from the pursuit of GDP growth. And the result is that we need a new economic model. one that is fit for the challenges of the 21st century. And the way that I like to describe that model is to imagine you're running a bakery. The size of the pie that you can produce in the future, your GDP, depends on the stock of ingredients in your pantry. Run out of ingredients, and tomorrow's pie is necessarily smaller. Of course, the core ingredients of economic prosperity are not just milk and flour and sugar. They are capital assets. They are things like a healthy, stable climate system, robust, resilient ecosystems, our natural capital. Inclusive wealth also includes our human capital, which is crucially not just the skills, but also the health of our populations. It includes social capital, which has come to the fore throughout the pandemic. Social capital refers to the trust that we have in each other as people, as well as the trust we have in business and in governments. It reflects the ability of communities and societies to overcome collective action problems. And the key challenges that we face in the 21st century, the climate, the biodiversity, the air quality crisis, are collective action problems. We need economic statistics that can help manage and guide our progress towards addressing these challenges. That comes from measuring our pantry, our inclusive wealth, those core ingredients of economic prosperity. And of course, they include physical infrastructure, which we already have good measures to account for, but it must focus on natural and social capital as well. Combined, these ingredients make up not just our inclusive wealth portfolio, not just our economic pantry, but they are the determinant of what is possible in the economy. They determine our capacity to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. I believe that's my time. I shall turn it back to Ron.
Weren't sure what you were pausing there for, collecting your thoughts. Great, thank you, Matthew. And I think I'd just like to pick up on one point that Matthew made in his talk, and that is the fact that we need to measure the pantry. The shocking truth is that governments do not measure the pantry right now, and that is, in fact, the problem. So the pantry includes human capital, social capital, natural capital, produced and financial capital. Of those five, we measure two at best, and we measure them only partially. Businesses don't run that way. Governments shouldn't either, but they do. So anyway, I'll leave it at that and turn next to Professor Bambang to give us his thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. And certainly, I'm glad to be part of this panel. And sometimes I wish, after learning a little bit about this inclusive wealth, I wish when I was Minister of National Development Planning, as you mentioned, I already understood about this concept. But I think now I like to use what you call imagination. Imagine if, let's say, Indonesia already has a complete data of comprehensive wealth or inclusive wealth, meaning that we have already accounted for, we have already made a good statistic, good and accurate statistic of the physical capital, financial capital, as well as the natural capital, human capital, and social capital. And if I try to remember again what I was doing in the Ministry of Development Planning, one of them, of course, we have to formulate the development policy. So when you are talking about formulating development policy, of course, we will focus on three key targets: economic growth, which is, of course, measured by GDP, the poverty rate, the number of poor people under the poverty line compared to the total population, and the third, inequality, using simply Gini ratio. Of course, you can measure all of these variables, but when you try to make a policy, then because you have poverty index or poverty rate measured separately from the GDP and measured separately from, let's say, inequality, then when you are trying to make a policy, it will be a little bit hard to make a policy that will create kind of balance between growth and, let's say, inequality. Usually, you know, in the real world, sometimes there is a strong trade-off. I mean, if you try to pursue too much, for example, poverty reduction and improving inequality, you might sacrifice growth, or the other way around. Of course, this is not what you want. I mean, if you are at the helm of making development policy, and if, let's say, at that time, we already had this comprehensive wealth data and information, certainly we can formulate policy not separately. We can formulate the policy that will ensure that we still create economic growth, especially in the short term, because unfortunately all the political term, you know, it's 5 years. I mean, for a country like Indonesia, for example. So you cannot tell your president, don't worry, everything will be good in next 10 or 20 years, while his term is only 5 years. So we have to come up with something, and one of them should be better economic growth, poverty reduction, as well as improving inequality. So with the availability of this comprehensive wealth, and let's say we can do a lot with this data, then I believe we can come up with a relatively short-term policy that will still create economic growth, but at the same time, we can also aim for poverty reduction and improving inequality without doing it separately using 3 different targets. And let me take one simple example. You know, when we are talking about economic growth, people will always challenge us. How can you come up with growth with quality? So, I mean, of course, if you only have GDP growth, that's the only data you have. And then to justify that you have growth with quality, then you try to show your poverty reduction and also improving inequality with separate variables. But with this kind of comprehensive wealth, you can show right away, yes, we can reach a good economic growth because, for example, our physical capital has been growing this far, our financial capital like this, our natural capital is also like that. So, and then human capital also contributes as well as social capital. So if we have all of this, then it will be easier, even for a politician, you know, a president or any elected official, to tell people, look, we have done policies that basically paying attention to the prosperity while still maintaining economic growth. Then basically we can forget the old concept of trickle-down effect that usually becomes one of the justification why economic growth is important. Because sometimes when we are talking about how to reduce the poverty, then our policy will go directly, how can we create direct transfer? Or in Indonesia case, how can we increase the fuel subsidy in order to reduce poverty? So we never think about what will be the impact of the economic growth to poverty reduction itself, because we always assume trickle-down effect will work, but actually it doesn't work. So with this kind of platform with comprehensive wealth, hopefully the way to help the people will be much better than what we did only with the GDP as the base of information. Another thing, I was assigned at that time to make a vision 2045 for Indonesia. The idea is 100 years of independence, 2045, Indonesia will be out of middle income trap. So the first thing we have to do is to look around the globe, which country that has been doing successfully to be out of middle income trap, not for a long period of time. I mean, there are many countries already try, but very few successful. And some of them try, but needs a longer time to do that. And with this kind of information, for example, South Korea, I would say is very amazing. they can be out of middle income trap is in a very short period of time. Maybe if there is a world record for getting out of middle income trap, they are the holders, you know, the world record holder. But the question, how can Korea be doing that while other countries have struggled to do that? Even in Asia, our neighbor, for example, Malaysia, they are trying to be out of middle income trap by 2020, 2 years ago. Unfortunately, by 2020, they haven't been there. Their GDP per capita still below the threshold for high-income country. And of course, you cannot answer, yes, because Korea can record double-digit economic growth for, let's say, 10 years. And then other country cannot do that. Well, I mean, it's not good, because then you cannot answer the reason why Korea can be that fast. With this kind of data, I believe the solution, the answer will not be on the GDP side. Yes, their GDP has been quite fascinating for some times in the past, but it's because they might have what? Strong human capital, strong social capital, work ethic, for example, in social capital, strong human capital, because everybody's talking about the quality of human resources in South Korea. And interestingly, they don't have much natural capital, but they can compensate that with those human and social capital. Those could be the difference between South Korea and even countries like Indonesia. So those are the things that I think very much interesting from the comprehensive. Last but not least, because at that time I was also like the supervisor for our National Statistic Office under Ministry of National Development Planning. Of course, we need to do more investment in order for them start to go for more detailed data on the wealth. And I believe after we complete the physical and financial as a part of the GDP, the next step to do is the natural capital, because Indonesia is very rich with the natural capital. Plus, we should start calculating for the human capital. Those are the things that I think very important for developing countries in order to make a good and suitable development policy in order to pursue higher economic growth while reducing poverty and inequality. Thank you very much, Rob.
Thank you, Professor Bombang, and I think those are really brilliant insights, and I love the South Korean example, and I mean, I think you're probably absolutely right. It is investment in human and social capital there that has made the difference. The problem is, as Professor Bombang has noted, we don't know what's made the difference because we don't measure human and social capital. So how could we be certain whether that's the difference or not? So these are the kinds of problems that are caused when we don't have proper measures, and the kinds of things we might be able to do if we did. So thank you again for that. I'd like to turn now to David Kachin in Jakarta and let him offer his thoughts. So please, David.
Thanks, Rob and colleagues, and it's a pleasure to be part of this panel today. I want to take a bit of a different view just to kick off. I think we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about these statistics at a national level. For obvious reasons, they're national level statistics to guide national policy. But I think it's also worthwhile talking about this at the project level. And as an economist at the World Bank, I work both in the research side of these issues, but also on the bank's operations and investments, the design and preparation of government investments. And because I'm part of the Environment and Natural Resources Department, that means investments that are often in natural capital. And I think taking a project level view of this can be instructive about the value of these statistics at a national level. So let me tell you about the first project I worked on at the World Bank. I was a newly minted economist, and I was tasked with doing the economic analysis for a reforestation project in Bangladesh. And it will always stick in my mind very clearly, because firstly, it was a very ambitious project. It was a $175 million investment by that government in its forest, 75,000 hectares of forest to be restored. And it included 18,000 hectares of mangroves along the coastline of Bangladesh. Basically, the government had a vision of a green wall along the southern coast, because as many people here will know, Bangladesh is very susceptible to impacts of climate change and megastorms, which strike the coast from that direction. And so the purpose of this analysis is to say, well, what's the value of this investment? Is it worth the investment to the government? And it's quite a standard thing. World Bank does it all the time. Is the project worth its return? And in the case of something like mangroves and forests, that's not an easy question. It's easier if it's physical capital, bridges and roads, things which can be quantified fairly easily in terms of its economic output on an annual basis. But on something like a mangrove, it doesn't show up in GDP. And in fact, placing those mangroves in those locations would remove areas of cattle production and remove areas of fish production in fish ponds. So it would actually reduce GDP, which is obviously going to factor into my analysis. But what they do very nicely is protect infrastructure. And this is important because Bangladesh is getting hit by more and more severe storms each year, potentially due to climate change. And my World Bank colleagues have spent a lot of time looking at how wave speeds and how wind speeds change as they are slowed, as they pass through mangroves. So they're very careful quantifications. They're quite impressive. There's 90% reduction over a 500-meter period. So if the waves go through those mangrove belts, they slow very significantly and thus reduce the damage on the other side. And so to understand the value of a project like this, what we had to do is to quantify the infrastructure that would be protected, the lives that would be saved as a result. In other words, physical capital and human capital, which are being saved as a result of this natural capital. So these are really wealth numbers. They're not GDP numbers. They're not short-term income. And that's the way the project had to be understood. And I think that's becoming better and better known, and the literature now is really supporting analyses like this. For instance, the latest World Bank numbers looking at this globally suggest that a value of a hectare of mangroves is about $1,600 per hectare per year in terms of the protection that it offers over time. So there's really two things that this exercise made clear to me. The first is that wealth in the form of the mangrove and GDP in the future is really clearly linked. And this kind of wealth accounting is crucial for making that link. So in quantifying the value of lives saved due to mangroves, we have to think about the potential losses, the labor losses due to storm damage in the future. So it's creating a direct link between the wealth we have now and the GDP we'll have in the future. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing we see in an analysis like this is the complementarities of capital. And I suspect we can talk about this more during our session today. But these capitals shouldn't be thought of as independent, but the way they add together is changing growth and economic opportunity in the future. So in the case of mangroves, if you put those mangroves in front of physical barriers, polders, which is a type of physical capital, human constructed, then what you get is not just the additive benefits of those two things together, but there's sort of multiplicative benefits. So the ability for the polders to function was very much dependent on the strength of the mangrove barrier in front of it. So those two types of capital working together were greater than the sum of their parts. So that was the second lesson I found from this particular analysis. So to close with this statement, firstly, I would like to say that our hosts here in Indonesia are very aware of this. We're investing in very significant mangrove restoration. But perhaps more broadly, if more countries used wealth accounts and included natural capital like mangroves, just for one example, perhaps other countries would be following in those footsteps. So thank you very much and looking forward to our discussion.
David, so much. And I mean, I think that's, again, a brilliant insight to take this discussion, which, you know, in my mind anyway, is really a discussion around national statistics, and to make the link down to how that kind of framework could influence decisions at a project level. And I think it's important to recognize that GDP has done that. So we very much think about how individual projects will influence growth, economic growth. So national level statistics do trickle down and to influence things like project level decision making. We just need the right national level statistics to make sure that at the project level we're considering the right things. So again, I think that's a really, really helpful insight. Thank you, David. I'd like to move now to Dr. Lau to give her the chance to offer her thoughts.
So I'm going to take a slightly contrary view, if you permit. In part because I think it's not enough to have the right sets of measures. I think what we've been hearing from some of the other panelists, and particularly Pak Bambang, is, we may have the right measure, but how do we get politicians, how do we get private sector to recognize that this is what we need to align to? Some of us thought that the SDGs, which were the first global integrated agenda, bringing together dimensions of economic, social, and environmental sustainability, were really going to be set a new course and change direction. And while we can't measure all the SDGs, we certainly had enough traction on a large number of the indicators. We then proceeded to think about costing and financing. But what was missing, if you don't mind my saying so, is really the how. How do we change direction so that the SDGs or inclusive growth or inclusive wealth in this instance matter? How do we go from what some people call a compensatory stage, where we do growth first and then compensate those who haven't benefited and who are poor and suffer from all the various ill effects of inequality, to saying they are the investment? How do we promote that kind of inclusive investment in human capital? How do we say natural capital is not for later? It's not for outsourcing production from developed countries to those developing, where we can then say it's their problem that they don't meet those environmental goals and targets while we remain green somehow. How do we say there is that need to change? And in part, it's because we've always had multiple ways of cooking the pie, as Matthew was saying. And maybe it's time to start saying we need different quantities of those ingredients if we want a pie that lasts longer, goes further, and is able to be more resilient in the face of all the shocks and changes that are coming to attack this little bakery, right? That we can't keep producing the pie the way we've done for millennia. Now is time for that kind of change, in part because we have to. Climate change is not waiting for us to get our policies right. They're not waiting for us to get green. It's here and now. So we need to think, what is the content of our growth? Are we dependent on sectors that are going to be dramatically impacted by climate? So we can't afford to do things as usual. Those countries that have made inclusive investments in human capital, and not just the 5% or the 10%, are also those that can pivot, that can turn to new directions, that can change the way we do development. And I say this in part because economists are very happy to work with black boxes, right? Every now and then you'll have some, raising their hand and saying, we don't really know what creates growth. We don't really know how it's sustained. Another couple of hands will come up and say, central banks ought to focus on other measures, because we really don't know what's the best way to get the economy back on an even track, or how to deal with inflation. And in fact, we continue to use, old tools designed for demand side to address some of our problems. So I think part of what we're saying is we need not only new measures, but we need to really make the investment case for how we need to shift, why the current business as usual is not working, even for those who prioritize growth. Because growth is not that black box that's going to keep on giving and giving. In fact, it's running into huge problems in many parts of the world. And second, I think we need to accept that the growth accelerations and that we're going to see are in fact going to be very different from the ones that we've seen before. And we don't need high levels of growth. What we need to do is to focus on sustainable growth. growth that is resilient, that builds on these different elements in a new way. Because the type of transitions that we're going to face and the type of problems we're facing call for a new set of solutions that need to have that investment case in a broader set of wealth metrics at its core. Thank you.
Yeah, again, another really insightful set of comments, and I mean, I couldn't agree with you more that what we need is resilient growth. We don't need more necessarily of the old form of growth. We need a new form of growth. And I guess the case that we're trying to make, those of us who are promoting measurement of inclusive wealth, is that unless we measure the assets that underlie growth and GDP, we won't know whether growth in GDP is resilient or not. So that's why I think the new measures are key, but you're quite right. The new measures alone will do nothing. It's new policies that rest upon those new measures, hopefully, that will change the course of development. So thank you very much for those comments. And finally, Professor Snower.
I would like to return to the question with which you started, which is, let us imagine a world in which this has already happened. We have the full set of measures that we need. What would that world be like, and how would we go about government policy, business strategy in that spirit? If we had that world, it would be an analogous situation to businesses that have both an income statement and a balance sheet. And inclusive wealth is the balance sheet. And the income statement is everything that generates the well-being from year to year. And those are the ways in which these two measures fit like a glove together. If you return to Matthew's analogy about the size of the pie depends on the ingredients in your pantry. If you just had the ingredients and you had no measure of the pie, it would be pointless to do the wealth. So you need both the flow of well-being, and you need the stock of things that enables this flow to continue. So I think on this we can be agreed. So in this new world, we would have good measures of human well-being alongside good measures of inclusive wealth. The second point, I just have 2 points to make here, is what would these measures contain? And there I think we can take very serious guidance from the measures of capital that you have. You have social capital and human capital and physical capital and financial capital. And let us just think about what that implies for the flow measures of well-being, because a change in the stock is equal to a flow. So social capital. You mentioned trust as a basic idea underlying social capital. Social capital also implies everything that we need as social creatures, a sense of embeddedness in society, a sense of belonging. All those things are not measured by GDP. So if you just look at GDP alone, you're going to miss much of what goes into social capital. The importance of trust lies not only in reducing the transactions costs to generate more GDP, it gives you intrinsic satisfaction to be embedded in social groups that you can trust. And so, therefore, the second insight is that as a flow, GDP is not sufficient. We need some measure of social well-being. And for that social well-being, at least two components are absolutely central. One is a sense of solidarity that is how well embedded you are in social groups to satisfy your needs as a social animal. And the other is a sense of agency, a sense of being able to influence your future through your own efforts. And all of that goes into your social capital. Now, with regard to the environment, a lot of that is missed in GDP. Take the mangrove example. If you just measured the input of mangroves to GDP, you'd be missing a lot of what mangroves deliver. When you sail past them, you're delighted by seeing them. They provide a measure of health that is not reflected in GDP, and so on and so forth. So environmental performance, which is a flow, requires natural capital as the stock. And so I think in this new world, we would have your various measures of inclusive wealth, along with the flow measures of GDP, for sure, solidarity, agency, and environmental performance. And if we keep those four things as the counterparts of the pie, then we can return to the questions that you asked, which is, what is it that policy should be driving towards? And the answer, I believe, is definitely the things that you talked about: GDP, poverty reduction, inequality reduction. But beyond that, you also want cohesive societies and societies that are not disempowered. And one of the problems with globalization in the last 20 years has been that globalization often tears apart communities where all of a sudden work shifts somewhere else, and people are left without their sense of social support. And it also disempowers people, because you can be working as hard as you did before, and all of a sudden your job is lost to a robot or to a team somewhere else. And therefore, if we take seriously policies that, in addition to promoting GDP growth and poverty and reducing inequality, they empower people, like active labor market policies, helping people to help themselves, or policies that create greater social cohesion, a lot of social policies, then we have the right mix for policymakers in this new world that you ask us to envision. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Snower. And I think we are all in agreement with that perspective, that what we need is not just a different framework in which wealth measures are added to GDP and then we're done. We need a broader way of conceiving of the benefits that we get from the wealth that we possess. That's an equally challenging question, if not more so than simply measuring comprehensive wealth, but we need to tackle that challenge. And if we don't, then I think we won't be benefiting as fully as we could from the development of these new wealth measures that we're talking about. So thank you for that. So I'd like to thank our five panelists for starting us off with some really brilliant insights and setting us off on the right foot for this discussion. For the remainder of the discussion, I'd like to pose some questions specifically to members of the panel. We don't have time, unfortunately, to let every panelist respond to every question, so I'm going to target my questions to specific individuals if you'll allow me to do that. So I'd like to start by asking Matthew and Dennis to respond to the following question. And in fact, Dennis, you've already started responding to it, so you're partway there. And the question is the following. In a world beyond GDP, where inclusive wealth measures already exist and are being used, what kinds of measures do you envisage? What sorts of things are statistical agencies producing that are useful? Who will produce them? So I mentioned statistical agencies, but are there other agencies involved as well? And who will use them? Is it ministries of finance that will use them? Is it ministries of development and planning? Is it businesses that will use them, or NGOs? Who will use these measures? And how will they be used? So this is a very practical question to sort of start the discussion. So why don't I ask Matthew to start, because A is before S in the alphabet, and then I'll let Dennis come in afterwards. So Matthew, the floor is yours.
May I thank you for letting me speak before Dennis, because he's a tough act to follow. These are excellent and critically important questions. Who will use the accounts? How will they be produced? Before we get to that, we have to understand that all accounts, all economic statistics, throughout history, going back even to the Domesday Book nearly 1,000 years ago in the UK, all economic statistics are political documents. They are tools for telling stories over time. What sorts of stories our accounts and statistics tell us is a political decision. There is no economic rationale. There is no economic requirement that a meal eaten in a restaurant is included in GDP and official economic statistics, and that a meal eaten at home is excluded. This is not economics, this is a choice. So the question before us today, and before the T20 and indeed the G20, is which political choices are we going to make? Which choices are we going to make about the stories that our statistics will tell us? If we want our statistics to tell us about the trade-offs that Bang Bang was telling us about, for instance, where there may be a trade-off between growth and inequality, or where there may be a trade-off between investing in physical infrastructure like airports and the impacts that that may have on natural capital because of emissions, then we can decide to have a system of accounts produced by our national statistical offices that has these trade-offs reflected within them. We can incorporate natural capital and physical infrastructure investments into the same portfolio. And when we do that, we have that built-in feedback mechanism between physical infrastructure and natural capital. David was absolutely right to point out that we should be thinking about a portfolio, the complementarities, the interrelationships between the capitals. The fact that good natural capital means healthy, clean, safe air, and that has a direct effect on the health of the population, its cognitive capacity, and its labor productivity. Natural capital and productivity are intrinsically aligned. And so what does this mean? It means that our statistics cannot just come from the Environment Ministry for natural capital, or from the Finance Ministry for economic data, or from the Health Ministry for education. But rather, we need at our national statistical offices the capacity to integrate the data across government. That's critical, which is why I say that one of the things we must invest in is not just the assets themselves, but also the statistical infrastructure, the capacity at national statistical offices, at universities, and in NGOs to develop the data and to share it. That itself is an asset for guiding policy. Robert made the point that businesses, and I think Dennis made the point as well, that businesses operate with both a balance sheet and an income statement. That cannot be understated. Governments do not do this. We must have national balance sheets that incorporate not only our assets and liabilities in a financial sense, for instance, our bond portfolios, but also that incorporate our natural capital, our social capital, and our institutional capital. And we can measure our natural capital. In fact, the United Nations Statistics Commission adopted last year a set of guidelines for natural capital accounts. Countries are already implementing these all around the world. And indeed, Robert is helping guide that process with great skill. The question is not just who produces them, but who's going to use them. We could use this information when we conduct economic analyses to investigate the likely impacts of government policy. Our budget watchdogs could use this information to determine whether our policies, whether our governments are indeed enhancing wealth or whether we are bankrupting the nation. The media could use this when we report on these statistics. We shouldn't just report on GDP, and in the UK, we have started to report on natural capital alongside our GDP statistics at the same time. And financial markets can use this information as well. The nation's capacity to generate prosperity into the future is a fundamental component of any investment decision. Should I invest in this country? Is it going to be able to support long-run growth or not? This is the kind of information that inclusive wealth accounts can provide for us, and it can be used by governments, by watchdogs, by the media, and by investors. And I think that is one of the reasons that we should push for the G20 and the T20 to consider very strongly the use of inclusive wealth alongside other economic indicators. And I believe that is my time.
Your time. Thank you for being brief. And I did forget to mention the need to keep responses brief to these specific questions. So thanks, Matthew. That was excellent. Dennis, please.
Good. I'll be very brief. You asked 4 questions. The first is what kinds of measures? And I believe the measures that we require can be summarized very simply. One is we need a measure of solidarity and agency. Solidarity is more like communitarianism, sense of what holds us together as a society. Agency is a sense of what gives us individual power over our lives, like classical liberalism. So those 2 things go into social capital. So on the flow side, solidarity and agency. On the stock side, social capital. Then we need a measure of material well-being, and GDP and its distribution and poverty and inequality are all aspects of this. And on the capital side, we have physical and human capital that are inputs into this process. And lastly, we need measures of environmental performance, and the stock is natural capital. So solidarity, agency, GDP, and environmental performance. That spells S-A-G-E, SAGE. That is what our dashboard is called in flow terms, and it corresponds perfectly to your social capital, physical and human capital, and natural capital, as well as the financial capital that goes into financing this. So those are the measures we need. Who should produce them? Well, in the first instance, those who are already producing them, those are researchers like Matthew, like us. We have all done work in producing time series over long periods for many different countries, and they show some very interesting insights. And that should then be handed on to the G20 countries as a first step. And these countries should use their statistical agencies to follow Matthew's advice, which is we need a whole of government approach to this, not separate ministries. And G20 countries should be mandated to provide these statistics from year to year as a way of assessing their progress in making this world a better place. Who should use these statistics? Well, for one thing, national governments should use them. And if we had these statistics, we could measure national performance on the basis of how well they do in promoting solidarity, how well they promote agency, how well they promote GDP, and what they do for environmental performance. So that would be very good, as well as complementary business measures. Business currently is involved in a jungle of different ESG measures, none of which are comparable and that are extremely confusing, presumably by design. that do not, therefore, have the same force as GDP, which is a coherent integral measure. We need to provide such consistency for GDP, and this basis, both the balance sheet and the income statement, is something that businesses will understand immediately, and they should be encouraged or probably obligated by the government to do so. And then how to use them? Well, very simply. Once we have the measures, then we need to make sure that these measures are introduced into the reporting mechanisms. So governments need to report on them, businesses need to report on them quarterly, annually. And then once they have reported on them, then the government needs to make sure that businesses live up to their responsibilities by ensuring that they have governance structures that enable them to adhere to the things they report on. And governments have a number of tools to do that. They can set the responsibilities of business. They can give businesses a license to operate. And if businesses do not pursue those social purposes, they could take that license to operate away. Governments can set targets like they do in the, for carbon emissions. They can do that for the other measures. Once we have them, it's easy enough to set targets. And then governments can induce this behavior directly through procurement contracts and other regulations. So governments have a wide variety of instruments at their control whereby they can create an equal playing field within which business can then compete, and then the profit motive will again be consistent with the promotion of well-being. Thanks.
Yes, I think it sounds simple, and it is simple, and I think we do know how to do it and what to do. The question that has always puzzled me is why we haven't done it long ago in some ways. But anyway, that's a question that only the celestial beings can answer. Thank you very much both to Matthew and Dennis for answering our first question. I'd like to turn to Professor Bongbong and to Dr. Lau to answer our second question, which is, how might it be easier to secure funding for the SDGs if inclusive wealth were already a central measure of national progress? So again, going in alphabetical order, we'll start with Professor Bongbong.
Yeah, I think if we use the information from the inclusive wealth, I think the SDG financing will be better targeted. So let me give you one simple example that very much applies in Indonesia. So we still have relatively high stunting. I think more than 24% children under 5 years in Indonesia suffer of stunting. So this is clearly a development problem. We need to really reduce the stunting. So of course, when you identify the stunting is still very high, it means, I mean, if all the information available in the comprehensive wealth, then your human capital will be relatively low, right? So how can we, solve the stunting? Of course, you have to allocate the budget in order to reduce the stunting. But the question, which part of the budget that should be allocated for different sectors in economy? If you look only at human capital, then certainly most of the budget will be automatically allocated, let's say, for the health sector, because health is part of the human capital, and human capital is relatively low because of stunting. But in fact, that's not 100% right. I mean, your target of, pouring the budget too much on the health sector might not really help to reduce stunting. It will help to some extent, but not at the optimal level. So how should you do that? We have to also look at the information, not only on the so-called the aggregate amount of physical capital, human capital, social capital, and also natural capital, and also financial capital. But we have to take a look into the component of each of the capital. For example, physical capital. There must be infrastructure, part of that. And then when we identify the infrastructure, let's say in Indonesia, infrastructure capital, yes, we have relatively big capital for road, for example, building the roads. But then we realize when we look at the component of the physical infrastructure, part of physical capital, our capital for clean water and sanitation, I think Matthew mentioned about that, are relatively low. So that's one of the reasons why we have higher stunting. So it means if we have a good data, good information about comprehensive wealth, then the idea to achieve the SDGs, goal related to clean water, sanitation, and goal related to health, I think will be better financed, because with the limited amount of financing that we always have, we can better target the budget. So instead of, let's say, allocating 100% only to health sector, maybe the best is 50% to the physical for clean water sanitation, and another 50% for the health. So that's the reason why I think having this kind of information, I think, will be helpful for development policymaker.
Yeah, it's so wonderful to have your insights on this, because you've made these decisions. So you speak from a position of real knowledge. So it's thank you so much. Dr. Lau, please.
Thank you. Just picking up a little bit on what Bang was already saying, a number of countries, including Indonesia, are looking at tagging or have been tagging their budgets with regard to climate, responsiveness, with regard to SDGs. And the question is whether that actually helps to get more financing to those issues. And I think the point that he was making, which is absolutely critical, that it's not enough to see how your budget is being spent and where it's being allocated, but really what impact it has. And I think this is the biggest change that inclusive wealth would bring about. It's not just the question of having a balance sheet, but really having impact indicators to see what difference that spending, that resource mobilization makes. And that's when we begin to see change. So if you look at New Zealand, they had been looking at living standards for over a decade, and it wasn't until fairly recently that they started to link it to the budget. But knowing that in any budget, you have very limited room to maneuver, and it's mostly at the margin. They could influence about 5%, if you like, of the budget, and that too by saying they wanted to see a change of at least 1% on the baseline of those targets. But if we had this inclusive wealth measure, I think it would just cause ripple effects from the macro to micro in terms of decision making. So if we were looking at public sector finance or public finance projects, we wouldn't look ideally at just doing a cost benefit analysis or looking at the rate of return. We would start to look at impact across these different metrics. And that would give us a step up. We would apply those multiple criteria in terms of other aspects of policy. Take the central bank, and fascinating discussion going on in the ECB prior, I should say, to Ukraine, but I hope it continues, around looking at what does bank policy look like when you're focused on transformation and not just on fiscal stability for today. Do you hold, what mix of assets do you hold? What does the bank hold? Does it increase the investment in green, for example? Does it reduce through a better pricing of risk? And this is a discussion Matthew and I were just having just before this. Start to really price the impact of climate change and take into account those kind of impacts of decision making, which we don't now. We don't look enough at it beyond stranded assets. So basically, it would allow for this kind of sea change in terms of potentially in terms of central bank policy, in terms of the way spending decisions are made by the public sector, but also in terms of the way taxation is done. Probably if we factor in inequality, a lot greater focus on progressive taxation, for example. And maybe looking at carbon inequalities, again, with that wealth lens. We know that it's the upper deciles that do most of the consumption spending, which is emissions intensive. So, why isn't that factored into the price they should pay in terms of that for all of us? So it would potentially make for all these type of ripple effects, as I mentioned, in macro and micro level, as well as through regulatory policies, in terms of shifting what kind of decisions financial institutions make, pushing ESG to go further towards SDG impacts, to not look only at the intention of business, but really the impacts of business decisions. And I think that's where we would get the maximum impacts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think it's fascinating to imagine how something as old as monetary policy could be changed fundamentally if we had a focus on both wealth and income or well-being broadly measured. And I think your point about the exercise that the ECB is engaged in is a case in point. If governments had wealth measures and focused on wealth measures, central banks would think very differently about something as traditional as monetary policy. So imagine the impact that it could have on environmental policy and social policy and health policy. I mean, really, it's quite remarkable to think about it. So thank you for those comments, Professor Bombang and Dr. Lau. All right, our third question is for David and Matthew. And it is, how might the climate crisis be handled differently if a stable climate were seen as an essential element of national wealth? So let's start with Matthew again in alphabetical order.
So thank you very much. I'm delighted by this discussion. I think the panelists, my colleagues on the panel have been brilliant. I would like to answer this question. How would climate change be handled differently if we were using inclusive wealth more completely? I think I have three topics I want to consider on this. First is investments versus costs. Another is on how we value fossil fuels and consider stranded assets. And another is the international dimension, which I thank Dr. Radhika Lal for bringing up consumption versus production-based emissions. I'm going to start with investments and costs. Climate change brings about two kinds of costs. There are the costs that we will face to roll out low-carbon, climate-resilient infrastructure, changing the energy system, the transport system, the food system, and our buildings around the world, so that they do not emit emissions, but rather sequester carbon, and so that they are resilient to the changes in the climate that are already coming down the pipeline. That will be costly. Estimates range from between 40 and 90 trillion. It will be costly. All of those investments generate fruitful returns and benefits, not just today, but long into the future. Getting fossil fuels out of transport will improve air quality. That's another component of natural capital, but it's critical to determining our human capital. We have demonstrated that students in London perform worse in their exams on days with high air pollution. There's a direct impact on cognitive capacity. It affects our human capital formation in schools, and it affects the use of that human capital in the labor force thereafter. There's a second kind of cost that climate change brings. And my heart goes out to anybody with family or friends or colleagues in Pakistan at the moment. But these costs are due to the devastation that a changing climate will bring us. Extreme droughts, extreme floods, fires, sea level rise. These costs we will face if we fail to decarbonize the economy, and they generate no long-term benefit. There's no return. So we have two kinds of costs. We have the investment costs, which generate dividends for decades, and we have the catastrophe costs, which generate nothing but pain and suffering. We're going to have to pay at least one of these. The sooner we make the investment side our priority, the less of the catastrophe costs we'll have to face. One thing that inclusive wealth would help us understand is how we value fossil fuels and assets, fossil fuel assets on balance sheets. If we were to take the social cost of carbon, the value of the damages that the carbon emitted from combusting those fossil fuels will generate, we would find that in most parts of the world, much of the fossil fuel reserve is actually a negative asset. It is worth more as a carbon sequestration tool, storing that carbon under the ground, than it is as an energy source and a contributor to climate change. This would mean we have a different view on whether or not we grant new drilling licenses and new mining licenses for fossil fuels. That would change the way our world works. And the final piece, I know I'm running to my time, the final piece I'd like to bring up is the international dimension, both because Dr. Lal has brought it up and because Bang Bang has brought it up on inequality. There are 2 points here to be made. We are seeing a rising cost of living crisis, largely driven by energy price inflation. This is driven because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We know this. If we had invested in the renewable infrastructure, scaling up solar and hydro and wind, reducing demand by having better buildings that are more climate resilient and lower carbon demanding, then we would be able to escape a huge amount of these costs. The increase in energy prices, my own work is showing in the UK, is equivalent to 2 times our expenditure on the NHS. That's a massive loss that we're spending on fossil fuels because we failed to invest in renewables. And the final thing that these wealth accounts could tell us is how wealth is transferred between countries through international trade. And this means we could have consumption-based accounts as well. We could be able to demonstrate that US consumption or UK consumption has a direct effect on the depletion of wealth in other parts of the world, and that this ought to be compensated in some way. By having this more complete picture, we would have a strong economic basis for taking a case to courts and taking a case to international agreements and to the G20 to demonstrate the effects that international trade is having on wealth around the world. I think that's my time.
Make the note that when I've done the calculations on the point that you raised about the actual asset value of fossil fuels, when you take the social cost of carbon into account, that for Canada, I come up with a negative number. So the value that Statistics Canada puts on Canada's fossil fuel assets is about $750 billion typically. If you deduct the social cost of carbon, if we use all those assets, it's about negative $200 billion. So that puts a really different perspective on investment decisions. So thank you for that, Matthew. David, please.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Matthew. My points on this are broadly aligned. I think about it like this. Climate change is sort of 2 externalities, at least 2 externalities at once. One's the externality between you and me, my emissions have an impact on you, and the second is the intertemporal dimension. So my emissions today are impacting my children in the future. And the wealth accounts, I think of them as really good at compressing information over time into a point right now. So they're inherently forward-looking because the wealth of an asset is a function of the income it's going to generate through time. And so they're really useful when you have a policy problem like climate change, because that's a big intertemporal problem. So when you're considering flows over time rather than just the flow right now, then that's helping you make better decisions. So to summarize what this means, I think of it as 2 things. I think it will increase motivation and increase diversification. Motivation in terms of investments in mitigation and resilience, and diversification in terms of diversifying economies. And we've already heard about some of those. Matthew was talking about costs and investments. So it would shift those investments and shift our attempts to avoid costs. So for instance, the depreciation of physical capital, which is likely to happen, it means that we're more likely to invest in things like natural capital to protect our physical capital. And then on the diversification side, as our panelists are pointing out, those fossil fuel assets are going to decrease. So recent World Bank calculations suggest a $4 to $6 trillion change in value decrease in those assets between now and 2050. And so that's going to both influence your decision about whether to have, say, a license for exploration, but also about your taxation arrangements on those assets now, and where you might invest those revenues given that. I think it might also allow us to highlight, say, renewable energy potential. If that in itself is an asset, your potential to generate renewable energy. And so if you're highlighting that, that's more likely to promote policies which are favorable to then realizing that potential. Once you measure that potential, you're more likely to go out and try and realize that potential. Finally, I think it has a lot of potential in terms of incentivizing sequestration, investments in forests, investments in seagrasses, other ecosystems which are going to sequester carbon. That suddenly becomes much more important. Finally, let me just say, I think what's crucial here is that, one, we have those wealth accounts which can demonstrate these different types of wealth. And then secondly, we need to do the climate modeling on the wealth accounts. And there's no reason that we can't. In fact, it's already done in many ways. Just like we predict the impacts of climate change on GDP, we can predict the impacts of climate change on wealth. And that gives us another set of dimensions which will then influence policies which I think are going to motivate more action than when we just consider effects on GDP. Thank you.
Important. I don't know of any macroeconomic model around the world that looks at the asset side of the economy. Everything looks simply at GDP, and we need to change that. So that's a really insightful point. And just on your point about diversification of the economy, I mean, Canada is the worst example in the world of diversification of the economy. If you look at investment in produced capital in Canada in the last 2 decades, what have we invested in? Oil and gas extraction. We've practically doubled the share of oil and gas extraction in our produced asset portfolio. What a ridiculous move to have made. We're digging our own hole, really. So it's a great point, David. So I'd like to just to quickly go to our last question and ask again Dr. Lau and Dr. Snower to address it quickly, if we could. The question is this: given the urgent need for many countries to address poverty and inequality and the limited government finances available to do so, how would a focus on inclusive wealth improve well-being outcomes for all? So if I could ask you really to give us just your most important thoughts on that question, and I'll start with Dr. Lau, please.
Thank you, Rob. And I'll be very specific. There was also a question actually in the Q&A that asked some of the same things. So to be very concrete, let me give 2 examples. Let's take the example of Mexico, which issued the world's first SDG bond in 2020. And what was interesting about what they did is that they focused not just on SDGs, but really on the regions or part of the country which were most behind in terms of the SDGs. And the bonds were oversubscribed. Following the bond in 2020, they went on to issue a second bond in 2021 with twice the maturity, going from 7 to 15 years, showing that there was appetite for such investments and ones that were inequality informed. This is really, and they've done the same thing with their budget. You know, the whole budget is really tagged with regard to the SDGs, right down to parsing out. You would love this as a statistician, you know, unpacking the sausage SDGs into the different components and different parts of it to get at the different dimensions of triple sustainability. And another example, which I've already hinted at before, is really both New Zealand, Iceland, a number of countries which have adopted the flow metrics of well-being indicators to inform budgetary decisions. And they've managed to make some a bit of a dent in terms of some of the most pressing problems, but it's been mostly on the expenditure side. And here's where, to deal with inequalities, we really also need to look, as I mentioned earlier, on the tax side. And while I was critical of the whole approach of compensatory states, it's certainly clear that without tax and transfers, inequality in Europe and the developed countries would look much, much worse. In fact, it would, be similar to some of the worst inequality measures elsewhere. So absolutely critical to look at both sides of the budget, taxes and expenditure, and channel those to addressing this, but also to look at the issue of really changing, as we mentioned, monetary policy. When we prioritize 2%, or when governments prioritize a 2% target and say it's okay to let the country go into recession, it's okay to let job losses go up, we're making the world a lot more unequal, because who benefits in terms of some of those changes? So if we were to adopt these, both the stock and the flow measures that have been discussed here, I think we would see a move towards fairer taxation, as well as more impactful expenditure to deal with these issues. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Again, really, really useful insight. So thank you. Dennis, please.
I'll be very brief. You mentioned poverty and inequality and how we would go about treating this in policy terms. I think Professor Bang has emphasized the importance of seeing poverty and inequality alongside GDP growth as targets of government policy. And what this discussion indicates is that poverty and inequality pertain not only to our material well-being, income, for example, but they also pertain to solidarity, agency, and access to environmental services. And recent empirical work that we have done indicates that across a good number of countries, those people who are income poor, the lowest decile, tend also to be solidarity poor and agency poor. Now that has huge implications for policy, because if these people who are income poor also have little sense of agency, then you cannot expect for them to push them into the labor market by reducing their employment benefits, as has been suggested by candidates for the prime ministership of Great Britain. And you cannot expect the trickle-down effect that you take care of, because they are not able to improve their own position. Therefore, they need to be given the tools whereby they can help themselves. If they are solidarity poor, then they are really in a mess, because then their social groups aren't even around to be able to help them in times of need. So if we combine these different measures of policy and inequality, we come up with a totally different conception of what needs to be done about poverty and inequality than if we just look at material well-being alone.
Yeah, again, couldn't agree with those comments more, so thank you. I did have a fifth question, but I'm going to not pose it. Instead, I'm going to turn to Professor Bombong to hear his thoughts on how he would summarize what we've heard this afternoon.
Yeah. I think number one, we need to start so-called formulating the global standard of measuring the wealth, especially on the other than physical capital and financial capital. So for most of developing countries, I think human capital will be very much needed. It's very urgent, I would say, because I believe when we have a good measurement of human capital, then we know whether we are in good position to have strong growth in the future, or we will have some kind of growth limitation in the near future. So I think for most of developing countries, the human capital will be very urgent. But then there are some developing countries, for example, that has quite significant amount of the natural capital, especially the one that has mining or plantation, like Indonesia. So in this case, of course, we need also to start measuring our natural capital, because it's also related to the idea of the mitigation of the climate change. So I think from this forum, from T20, of course, we should try our best to convey the message to the G20 leaders. That has been, sounded before, that beyond GDP becomes a necessity, and inclusive wealth or wealth will become one alternative. But of course, we need to move gradually by, number one, I guess, improving the calculation of GDP itself, especially on the production capital. And then we start moving beyond GDP by, first of all, setting the standard, global standard on how to measure the human capital, next natural capital, and maybe social capital will be very last, because I believe from my perspective it will be the most difficult one to quantify, especially you mentioned about the solidarity. I mean, it's nice to see, but how to make it on the measurement, I think, will be quite challenging. So I think that will be my take from this session. And again, I think this is one of the very important breakthrough, I believe, when we are talking about balancing between growth and prosperity.
Great, and I think the good news is that work is beginning on that global standard already. So, and in fact, I would say that we do know a lot about what we need to measure and how to measure it. There are some challenging aspects to it for sure, but this challenge of developing the standard is being taken up, but not quickly enough and not by enough countries and institutions and so on. So I think that's a message that should be heard loud by governments around the world. So thank you for that. I'd just like to offer, first of all, to thank all five of our panelists for what I think has been a really, really rich discussion. I've certainly learned a lot about it, and I've been thinking about this stuff for 30 years. So it's great to have all of your insights and so on. I'd like to again thank TF9 and T20 Secretariat overall, all of our colleagues who have helped put the session together today. It's been extremely well run. And just a couple of thoughts about what we've heard. I think the primary takeaway from today's discussion is that measuring inclusive wealth is about understanding investment in a different way, thinking differently about what we think of as an asset and thinking differently about what governments and businesses should invest in. It's beyond investing in just produced capital and bonds and stocks and so on, and it's about investing in human capital. It's about investing in social capital. It's about investing in natural capital and also produced and financial capital. It's a balanced way of thinking about all of those investments in a way that will ultimately sustain long-term well-being for everybody in society. I think that that's what this discussion is really fundamentally about. And I hope that has come through for all of you this afternoon. So again, thank you, and I'd like to ask for a round of applause for the panelists. And with that, I think the session is closed. Thank you again for everybody who came this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you may be in the world. Thank you.